Looking at the newspaper yesterday, one article caught my attention. I'm just going to read directly. It's not very long, so I can read this directly. China lashes out at critics of North Korean atrocities. China rejected unreasonable criticism of Beijing in a new UN report on human rights abuses in North Korea, but would not be drawn on whether it would veto any proceedings at the Security Council to bring Pyongyang to book. North Korean security chiefs and possibly even Kim Jong-un, the leader of the country, should face international justice for ordering systematic torture, starvation and killings comparable to Nazi-era atrocities, UN investigators said on Monday. The unprecedented public rebuke and warning to a head of state by UN inquiry is likely to further antagonise Kim and complicate efforts to persuade him to rein in his country's nuclear weapons program and confrontations with South Korea and the West. The UN investigators also told China, Kim's main ally, that it might be aiding and abetting crimes against humanity by sending migrants and defectors back to North Korea to face torture or execution, a charge that prompted a sharp rebuke from Beijing. Of course we cannot accept this unreasonable criticism, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying said at a briefing yesterday. We believe politicising human rights issues is not conductive towards improving a country's human rights. We believe taking human rights issues to the International Criminal Court is not helpful to improving a country's human rights situation. Hua would not answer what she said was a hypothetical question on whether China would use its veto powers if the UN was brought to the UN Security Council for further action. Diplomats expect China to block any such proceedings. Asked why China blocked UN investigators from going to the North Korean border, across which many North Koreans cross illegally, Ms. Hua said she would not comment and would not have to look further into the matter. These people are not refugees. We term them illegal North Korean migrants, she added. China deals with these people appropriately in accordance with international domestic laws and the humanitarian principles, Ms. Hua said, declining to provide an estimate for how many of these people have crossed into China. The investigators told Kim in a letter they were advising the UN to refer North Korea to the International Criminal Court to make sure any culprits, including possibly yourself, were held accountable. In a statement in Geneva, North Korea categorically and totally rejected the accusations in the report, saying they were based on material faked by hostile forces backed by the US, EU and Japan. That report's by Ben Blanchard in Beijing. Okay, that's a pretty typical response from Beijing in terms of any criticism directed at itself. It never accepts criticism. But I also think it's a bit of a cruel irony that she has the audacity to claim that the Chinese oblige by humanitarian principles in terms of how it deals with North Korean refugees. These people are not refugees. We term them illegal North Korean migrants. China deals with these people appropriately, in accordance with international and domestic laws and humanitarian principles. That's just a cruel joke, because for China to claim that it deals with North Korean refugees in a humane way is just, it's sick, because what China does is throws them back into the world's worst dictatorship. And let's make no illusion about this, North Korea is a brutal, brutal regime. Even if you don't believe everything you hear about North Korea, and it's true that some of it may be South Korean propaganda, that's a possibility, the fact that it is such a closed regime in itself indicates just how bad it is, because if it had nothing to hide, it wouldn't be so closed. There's no illusions about it, because everyone who has escaped from North Korea has testified to just how awful it is. And these photos basically have been shown at the UN. Chinese netizens have reacted to that with shock, apparently. China is just trying to save face here, basically. They're trying to cover up the fact that they are deeply complicit in North Korea's crimes. There's issues like the nuclear program that China has condemned. Well, they should condemn, and there's pressure on them to do so. But when it comes to human rights, China... And for me this is an alarming situation, because if China does become the global superpower, it will absolutely take no leadership whatsoever in human rights violations around the world. Not to mention the fact China itself still has a very long way to go That goes without question. But if China, let's say for the sake of argument, does replace the US as the sole superpower, China would be a superpower that allows any dictatorship to do whatever it wants. Because the Chinese attitude is, oh well, my neighbour's house is on fire, I'll ignore it, because it's his or her business. That is the Chinese mentality. It's about time China started taking some responsibility in this world and living up to its moral obligations as a major power. And this is nothing but an excuse from the spokeswoman, because of course China has humanitarian obligations to help the North Koreans. And I don't accept the claim that, oh, China's overpopulated, because there's parts of China that are not overpopulated. Heilongjiang province is not overpopulated, and that's one of the closest provinces, and the same applies to Jilin. If you look at the demographics, they're actually underpopulated. When we talk about overpopulation in China, that's not a consensus across the whole, it's not a general situation across the whole country. There are some provinces in China, I would argue, could take on North Korean refugees on humanitarian grounds. That would show the world that China is serious about taking some moral leadership. But the idea that we abide by humanitarian principles, it's just a cruel joke. It's basically sending the lambs back to the slaughter, and it's disgraceful. And I made this point in another video, European countries are expected to take a moral obligation, for example, on Syrian refugees. I would argue China's closest big power, well, Japan maybe also has obligations in that sense, but actually North Korea, it makes sense that China is the first port of call, because it's a country that one of the ethnic minorities in China is Korean, so presumably there wouldn't be a major ethnic cultural clash there, because Korean is one of the minorities in China. So really what I'm looking at here, the way I see it, is just excuses coming from Beijing. And of course they're not going to take criticism, because Beijing never does. So it's really quite pathetic for China to take that stance. They do have moral obligations. It's about time China started acting on its moral obligations as a major power.